Hello and welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, and the aim of this podcast is to explore relatively modern movies, not necessarily always the acclaimed ones, and just find some of the stories behind the scenes of the making of the films, the problems that they encountered, and just some of the nuances involved in putting big movies together. I'm going to be back in the 1990s, a particular passion area of mine, for our next film, which is 1992's adaptation of Patriot Games, directed by Philip Noyce, based on the novel by Tom Clancy, and starring Harrison Ford. So let's start with hopefully a slightly more volume adjusted clip from the movie.
Here in Washington, D.C.
That's it then, huh?
That's it. You know, on second thoughts, maybe I won't have a drink with you.
Okay, then I'll go home.
Have a safe trip.
I'll go home and call the TV stations. Give them what they want. Let them take their cameras into my daughter's hospital room. Put it on the evening news.
In 1990 then, Paramount Pictures scored a sizable success with the first Tom Clancy film adaptation based on his book, The Hunt for Red October. This was the one, of course, that starred Sean Connery and his legendary Russian accent. John McTiernan directed that. McTiernan, of course, best known for Die Hard and Predator. Mace Newfield produced the movie and would stay with the Jack Ryan films throughout. And a happy little bit of nerdy trivia that will never win anyone a pub quiz, but what the heck. The Hunt for Red October actually shot on the soundstage next to Dead Again. Dead Again being Kenneth Branagh's very first Hollywood directorial project. Branagh then would consequently go on to direct the fifth Jack Ryan film, Jack Ryan Shadow Recruit. If that ever wins you a pub quiz, first of all, you owe me 10%. Secondly, I'd really love to know the name of the pub, because that's the kind of quiz I want to go to. When it came to Patriot Games, lots of pieces of the jigsaw were not fitting too well. Clancy had been frustrated by the changes made to his novel for The Hunt for Red October, and also he had just a little bit more clout now. John McTiernan was still targeted to direct the film, and Alec Baldwin was in theory he was the incumbent Jack Ryan. He was set to star in it. But it would be fair to say things soon took a turn. Looking first at McTiernan then. McTiernan had been asked by producer Mace Newfield to direct after the success of The Hunt for Red October. He was the incumbent. He was in the right spot. And Newfield had acquired the rights to both Patriot Games to Patriot Games and the subsequent book Clear and Present Danger. He thought that Patriot Games was the more personal story and Clear and Present Danger the more expansive one, and thus he wanted to start with Patriot Games. Newfield's given an interview in the past where he talked about how he got McTiernan interested, but while Newfield was away, apparently, and again I cover this for lawyery reasons, but apparently McTiernan took a meeting with Paramount Pictures chief Brandon Tartikoff, I think that's how you pronounce his name, and while Newfield was away, and told the Paramount boss that doing Patriot Games first would be a massive franchise-killing mistake. And that Clear and Present Danger should go first. Newfield did not take this news well, and was soon on the hunt for a new director. He said that he didn't want to work McTiernan again after that happened. I don't have McTiernan's side of that particular story, but there were other things going on here as well. Alec Baldwin, I mean, numerous stories have come out in recent times about why he didn't play Jack Ryan in that second film. And in fact, he gave an interview a while ago where he talked about about why he didn't do Red October, because the given story at the time was he was off doing A Streetcar Named Desire on Broadway, which was true. He was doing that. However, there were financial negotiations going on with Baldwin. Also going on in the background of this was his high-profile relationship with Kim Basinger at the time, and they were making a film together called The Marrying Man, which I think was at Disney. And the stories coming from the set of The Marrying Man, at least the gossipy stories, were fractious. They were making the headlines for the wrong reasons, and with Baldwin's deal was on the heavy side in Paramount's views, and with the hassle going on elsewhere, they just decided, if you follow one story, that they just didn't want Baldwin on the movie. Separately, Harold Becker, who's known for, I mean, he would make the film Malice, which came out, I think it was about a year after Patriot Games in the end. A year or so after. But Harold Becker, who's building up a reputation for his thrillers, obviously, he was putting together a film with Harrison Ford, a period movie to do with trains, I believe it was, around the same time. And this was going to be a fairly hefty film at Paramount. Harrison Ford had just done Regarding Henry with the studio for director Mike Nichols, and that had struggled. And when the Harold Becker project fell apart, all of a sudden Paramount had Harrison Ford available. It had a Jack Ryan project, and it didn't want to work with Alec Baldwin on the next film. Now, Baldwin's take on this, as per the interviews that he's given out, was that Paramount, he said, had been negotiating to do a film with a very famous movie star, and we can guess that that's Harrison Ford, who dropped out days before, and so they owed him money for a greenlit film, and thus they moved his contract onto Patriot Games. Now, what you believe and where that comes from, what's very clear is this wasn't a very clean takeover of a role, and Baldwin is still said to feel quite sore about it. Ironically, in the end, Harrison Ford would be paid $9 million to play Jack Ryan in Patriot Games. And when you consider that the film itself cost just slightly short of $50 million to make in the first place, it would suggest that Alec Baldwin, money was not the only factor there. But again, that's my outside just perspective on it, and you can fill in some of the own blanks yourself. Now, in terms of finding a new director, Philip Noyce actually at the point was riding high off the back of the terrific thriller. I do urge you to seek it out if you've not seen it, Dead Calm. Now, Dead Calm was a film that was overseen by George Miller. And it turns out that's Mad Max, George Miller, of course. And it turns out that Sam Neill was strangely pivotal in helping Noyce land the Patriot Games role. Sam Neill had appeared in Dead Calm, but the rumours that were going around the industry at the time was that Dead Calm had actually been ghost directed by George Miller, that Noyce hadn't done the bulk of the movie. And so Mace Neufeld rang Sam Neill up to try and find out, well, is this true? And it was Neill who put it right. It's like, no, this is Noyce's film, that Miller was around. Miller had opinions, but this was very much a Noyce film. Now, one other thing on Patriot Games that also always muddies the water of the conversation is the Irish politics that underpin it, that were uncomfortable in the early 90s. They were toned down somewhat from the book, but there's a story in there too that John McTiernan, for instance, actually turned down making the film due to its handling of the Irish politics and the IRA storylines within it. Nonetheless, as it would come to pass, Philip Noyce and Harrison Ford both signed on to do the film, and so Noyce wanted to get a flavour of Tom Clancy. He wanted to meet the author behind the book, and so he arranged a trip, and he took his 10-year-old daughter, and this is described in the book Backroads to Hollywood by Ingo Petzker, which talks about Philip Noyce. It is Philip Noyce's biography, with which he worked with the writing of. And Noyce in that book recalls driving to see Clancy, taking his 10-year-old daughter, and approaching a house that looked like it could be Jack Ryan's. And apparently Clancy greeted them wearing army fatigues, and his 10-year-old daughter turned around. He said to his 10-year-old daughter, "Why is he dressed like that?" And it was his 10-year-old daughter who apparently said, "I think it's some kind of statement, Dad." And it would turn out, she was probably right. Now, the book had to be changed, whether Tom Clancy liked it or not. And let's just go with he didn't. But for instance, Prince Charles is a character in the novel, and that was never going to happen. And so there were some character tweaks that were going to be needed to be made. But also, in terms of fitting Patriot Games to the demands of what had become a Paramount blockbuster feature film, there were other tonal changes. And there were changes made to the character of Jack Ryan, and Clancy was not happy about this. Clancy complained that the ideology of Jack Ryan was changed from being a right-wing character to a left-wing character. And he complained very loudly about this, and he would send regular faxes to the film production, the film production office, and to the people making the film. And eventually, as recalled again in the book Barrows to Hollywood, the filmmakers just had to stop reading the faxes. They just had to get on with making the film. They were up against such pressure as it stood, and it would be fair to say that Clancy was hardly greasing the wheels of getting the film made. Now, in the interests of fairness and balance, Clancy clearly had a position on it. He wasn't happy with what happened with The Hunt for Red October, although it turned to be a hugely successful film, and he wanted his characters and his stories treated right, and he was new to the Hollywood game as well. So all these things were just mixed into a pot. And the thing that really upped the pressure on it was filming didn't actually start on Patriot Games until October 1991. And this is a film that was due in American cinemas in June 1992. We didn't get it to a couple of months after in the UK. But nonetheless, that's 8 months, 9 months to put it together, start to finish. Now, a crucial thing on this, we talk about this sometimes about how films start shooting quite late in the modern era, and a lot of that is down to the speed that's afforded by digital editing and digital distribution techniques, that digital editing systems and multiple editors working on them allow for a faster pace of editing. It doesn't build in thinking time, but again, that might be a discussion for another podcast. When it actually comes to the distribution, because they're going out on what are known as DCPs now, but these encoded hard drives, a studio still has to get those produced, but it can leave it a little bit later in the cycle because they don't have to strike physical heavy prints and get cans of film distributed around the country. Patriot Games didn't have that luxury, though. And so that they were in the autumn of 91. And to hit that June release date, they were going to have to get going. Now, Patriot Games, it's often described as an action film, but I don't think it is. I think it's a thriller that's got a couple of key action sequences. And as it would happen, one of those action sequences caused quite a lot of problems. I'll come to that just in a second. They shot in England for a chunk of it. They were shooting in and around London and with buildings with, there were 15th century buildings with the original windows intact. So they had to temper, for instance, the explosives that they used in the film so that they didn't blow out these windows that had survived hundreds and hundreds of years. When he was in the American component of the shoot, Noyce, and this was a press story around the time of the making, it was the first Hollywood film that was allowed to shoot officially shoot the outside of the CIA headquarters in Langley, and also the first film, you can see the shot in the film with the crest on the floor, of the lobby of Langley as well. Now, with Patriot Games, the CIA was cooperative with the movie. With the follow-on film, and I may come to this in a future podcast, Clear and Present Danger, they were certainly a lot less cooperative because the CIA is portrayed in a lot less favourable a light. But in terms of going back to the physical production, the film shot for 18 weeks and it was shooting 6 days a week through that time. There was a break for Christmas Day, a little bit, but the production didn't afford an awful lot more than that. And to hit that, Philip Noyce found himself editing the film during lunch and at the end of shooting every day, and he described it as the most physically exhausting film he'd ever made at that point. He's done some big blockbuster movies since, and I'm curious how that would compare. But certainly, from the films he was coming from, this was insane. This was a huge culture shock, and it was also an utter race against time. The deadline had been firmly announced, as it would be for Noyce's next couple of Hollywood movies, Sliver, Clear and Present Danger, where he had to hit this very, very specific release date. The problem they kept hitting with Patriot Games was the ending, though. This is going to be spoilery, so I should flag that, so I will. This is going to be spoilery. Now, the ending of the film ends with a big speedboat-based action sequence between Harrison Ford's Ryan and Sean Bean's character, the human spoiler Sean Bean. So you can pretty much guess which way it goes, even if you don't see the spoiler warning. And this was turning into quite a tricky ending to get. And in the end, it was reshot 3 times. Now, what you actually see when you see Harrison Ford in the version that made it to the end is he's actually never moving. I didn't know this, and I went back and had another look, but I discovered he's never moving in that scene. And what they did to make that is they shot it in the parking lot of Paramount Pictures in Los Angeles. The producers turned that parking lot, which had a slope in it, which afforded them the opportunity to do it, into a giant sea, and they made sure that Ford was always stationary. They also then sent a second unit out to get loads of the choppy seawater and the stormy weather, and the second unit had the hardest job, as most people tend to concede, and they did something like 25-30 days to get their bit. But the bits where you see Harrison Ford, he's never actually moving. It's all the effects going on around him that obviously give the impression of the movement. Now, the original ending of Patriot Games was supposed to be a hand-to-hand fight underwater, but problems ensued. The water, for instance, was dirty. They couldn't filter the water, and after 3 nights of filming these underwater fights between Ford and Sean Bean, Ford was actually starting to get an infection. He didn't tell anyone. They just picked it up and noticed. He also hit his head in an underwater in one of the underwater shots and ended up struggling for air. And apparently that was a little bit hairy for a minute. But the ending, when they came to see it, and Noyce and Ford hadn't got off to the best of start. Ford was reportedly a little less trusting of the approach Noyce was taking at first, until Noyce edited footage together and showed Ford, and then they turned into very close collaborators. Although they'd have more problems on the next film, but again, we'll come to that another point. But they kept reshooting the ending of Patriot Games because it simply wasn't working. And now the problem was Sean Bean at the time was committed to filming Lady Chatterley. You might remember the TV series that certainly was one of 2 key TV series that really put him on the map in the UK. And so he had to have his haircut and get prepared for the look of Lady Chatterley when he was called back to refilm the ending. If you look very closely at the ending of Patriot Games, in the ultimate sequence that happened, Sean Bean has 2 different haircuts. You do have to look very, very close. But that ending that you see, and they decided they just needed a more traditional fist fight, a very clear, obvious to see fist fight with a very obvious resolution. I think it's probably the weakest bit of the film. Personally, I think the whole bit where they rampage through the house is very, very tense and really well done. As soon as they go out to sea, I think it loses it a little bit, but nonetheless, aiming for a blockbuster audience, they needed something a little bit more straightforward, and so they reshot that ending. Let's go back to those deadlines again. They've got to hit that June release. They've got to get all those prints struck. They've got to do the publicity tour. They've got to screen it for press. That ending was shot a month before release. So throw in then the editing of that put together, and apparently with the first press screening of Patriot Games, the sound was still being mixed as the first reels were being played. And so they did actually finish the film as the film was being shown for the first time. Incredible, really, but obviously 35mm projection, several reels, they were able to do that. And eventually the film hit its deadline. Now, by this time, Tom Clancy had been, who was no friend of the production really in the end, but he had been loudly complaining in the press. He'd taken his complaints public about the movie, and he talked about how, I think it was something along the lines of 200 scenes in the film, only one of them reflects his book. But as it would happen, he would go a little bit quieter just in the run-up to the film's release, and he'd reverse his position from being asked to be taken off all the publicity to allowing his name to go on it, although it's still missing from an awful lot of the promotion for the film. Apparently, one of the things that was going on at the time is the rights were being sold for his their next Jack Ryan novel that he just penned, The Sum of All Fears. Paramount was keen to stay in the Jack Ryan business, and was doing a deal with Clancy for those rights just in the weeks or 2 leading up to the release of Patriot Games. Now, this particular story did of course have a relatively happy ending. The film was well received. The film was a box office hit. It did attract a lot of kickback for its handling of Irish politics. Something Ford would come up again with the film The Devil's Own a few years later, directed by and it was the last film with the late great Alan J. Pakula. And so the issue would come again. But in terms of where that left Jack Ryan, it left things as Mason Newfield had intended, with enough box office to be able to press ahead with the next film in the series, which I think is the best, but then happy to debate it, Clear and Present Danger. Thanks so much for joining me for Film Stories. If you can help me spread the word, I'm just one person in a room telling nerdy stories about films. That helps me enormously, and it's hugely appreciated. If you want to leave a 94-star review, that helps as well. You can find me on Twitter @Simon Brew, and I'll be back hopefully in about a week or so with more film stories. Take care.